Hey, it's Brooke. Do you have a website? And on your website, do you have a privacy policy? If you don't, you're going to want to watch this video because it's high time that you get a privacy policy, even if you think that you don't need one. Okay, so last week, I'm filming this the last week in May, and last week I'm wondering if you got bombarded in your inbox with a bunch of emails from maybe some lists that you've signed up to that said that they have changed their privacy policy. And this is in the wake of something called the GDPR, which is a legislation that is happening in Europe. However, it does apply to people here in North America, including Canada. If we have anyone from the European Union on our marketing lists. Now, I'm not going to get into that specific thing in this video, but I am going to get into the privacy policy because I think that is the first step in becoming GDPR compliant, and it is the first step anyway, regardless of whether the GDPR even exists. You need to have one on your website, and I'm going to tell you why. If you are taking any sort of information from people from your website, even if it's just a simple email address, you don't even have to be getting their first name. You need to be accountable and transparent as to how you are managing, storing, and what you're doing with that information. Different companies have different legislation, different jurisdictions have different legislation. So we want to be mindful of that. But we also, as a whole, want to think about privacy in general as we're conducting business over the internet. We've all heard about internet hacks, and the internet is probably not always 100% secure. However, when people are doing transactional business with us on our website and giving us information, whether it be an email address all the way down to some other personal information, names, addresses, maybe even credit cards, we need to tell them where, why, how, all of the details, what we're doing with that information, obviously to cover our butts and also for the concern and safety of the privacy of the people that we're interacting with through our website. So I want to go through a couple of things that your privacy policy should contain. Now, this is not a formal checklist. I'm actually going to include a checklist below this video if you're watching it on YouTube or if you're watching it on our blog. The checklist I'm including is not a blanket checklist for everybody. So you need to do your own due diligence in your jurisdiction to make sure that the privacy policy that you're putting on your website is going to pertain to the types of people that you have coming in, and also that pertains to the law where you live. What I'm going to tell you here are some good blanket things to have anyway that you should probably consider throwing up on your website today. The first thing is, what information are you going to obtain from clients? And this could be a lot of information. Some places on your website you may just take an email address. Some places you may be taking more information than that. How are you going to store that information? How are you going to use that information? And do third parties have any access to that information? And most likely the answer to that is yes, because if you're using any sort of CRM, if you're using any sort of MailChimp, anything like that is outside, you're paying a service or maybe even not paying a service, but they could potentially have access to it, or it may be being stored somewhere else, then you need to let them know. You don't necessarily need to go into full details as to where everything is, but essentially you're being honest is that third parties could have access to that data. You also want to go through what you're doing to protect their information. And this is going to be different for every business, whether or not you're taking credit card information. I know credit card processors usually store that information. I never have any access to credit cards or credit card details on my end when I do credit card transactions. But you want to be honest on how you're storing the information, and again, why you're storing it. So if somebody comes onto my website and they want to opt into, the newsletter, or they want to opt into some sort of program, then that's what we would be using the information for, and not to, go sell to a third party or not to promo some other thing that I'm doing somewhere else. And this is where the GDPR comes in, basically saying what you can and cannot do with information that comes in. The laws are a little bit different in the US, and I don't want to confuse anybody here. But you do need to be clear on how that information is being processed. And if you do have people from the EU on your list, you can only send them things to which they have requested. That's it. You also want to talk about things like cookies. Some websites, and your website may not be using cookies to track certain, they're pretty benign, but not identifying details, but, tracking details for data purposes. You want to disclose that, and definitely pay special consideration to any types of things that are on your website that may be a little bit different than everybody else, such as location tracking or GPS, which is an opt-in. People absolutely have to opt in for things like that, but I go into websites all the time where people want to send me push notifications. So if you have stuff like that, what kind of information you are actually obtaining from them and how that is being used in the background and what kind of, in that sort of program. Something else you want to include is definitely how to access their own personal information, or if they want to request to see what kind of information is being stored and who is the person. Obviously, larger businesses will probably have a designated person. Smaller businesses, it's probably going to be you. Who's the point person to contact? You should always, always, always have a contact person on your privacy policy. Who is the person to contact if and when they want to request that information? You want to aim overall for transparency. You want to be honest. You don't want to promise things that you don't know about or that you can't keep. And you want to be honest and take a good look at your website and what systems that you are using on your website, such as those things that require special consideration, any location, any push notifications, things like that. Where do you put your privacy policy? So you want to create a separate page specifically for your privacy policy, and a lot of the times it sits in the footer where there may be a legal disclaimer on some websites. Other times it could just be the privacy policy. Maybe you have some purchase policies or other things down there. So that's a good place for it to sit. I know when I go to look for one, that's where I would always look. But you also want to make it easily accessible, and I think now because all of this stuff has kind of come to the forefront, I wouldn't hesitate to put it other places, and I would definitely make a link to it any place where people are looking to sign up for anything, whether that's a program or a service or even just to a mailing list. I would definitely put a link to your privacy policy that's easily accessible there that they can see. And in some cases, you may want to ensure that they check off that they've read it, depending on what kind of information you are getting from them. You can also put it in your About section, maybe at the bottom, if you have a drop down in your About menu item, you can put it there. I wouldn't be too concerned about having a few touch points for this privacy policy. I think it's better to have it front and center than hidden away. So take a look at your website now, even if you have one, and make sure that it's going to be easily accessible and that people who need to see it can access it really easily. So again, this was just a quick rundown about why you need a privacy policy and some of the things that you need to put on it. In your jurisdiction, you may have different rules and regulations for your industry. For the types of things that you have on your website, you may have some other things that you want to consider. So this is something that you need to do your due diligence about. Definitely get one app at least. In the meantime, I'm including a link to a privacy policy checklist. This is sort of a blanket checklist. It doesn't necessarily meet your specifications. So you're responsible for doing your due diligence. I just wanted to let you know. So if you don't have a privacy policy, it's time to get one done. Make it a priority today. And if you do have one, make sure it's easily accessible and people can access it. Talk to you later.